Model Making Guru is sponsored by emodels.co.uk. Make something awesome. Hey everyone, it's Foxx from modelmaking.guru here. Hello and welcome my squishy friends to part 2 of my build of the Leman Russ battle tank in Hello Kitty livery. Yes, welcome. Now if you remember in the last episode we got all the base colours down and we did a quick and dirty oil dot filter just to make it look a little less pink and shiny and brand new. And in this episode we're going to do all the rest of the filthy dirty weathering. Yes, so let's make a start. So for the first step we're going to go back to oil paints, and I've dug out from my special drawer some 502 Abtai Long Starship Filth. Ooh, yeah, best oil paint ever. Now I'm going to make a wash, so I'll need some thinners, and I'm using De La Rowney oil paint thinners. These are artists' oil paint thinners, but any oil paint thinners will do, or even thinners for enamel paints, because they're all the same thinners. If you're in the US, they might be called mineral spirits. I do recommend you go for oil paint thinners, and odourless ones at that, not just a bottle of meths or turpentine, because they stink. Odourless oil paint thinners, strangely enough, are odourless. And I'm going to make a wash now of the beautiful Starship Filth. Ooh, Starship Filth. Ooh, it's the best colour. It's the perfect colour for just washes that want grease and grime. It's just fantastic. Ooh, I've got many tubes of it, many tubes hidden away in a super secret drawer. Now what I've basically made is quite a very thin wash, because what I'm going to do now is a pin wash, but a bit of an unusual pin wash. Typically, a pin wash, you gloss varnish your model, and then you get your very thinned oil or enamel paint and you touch it to erase detail, and because of the glossy surface, the paint or the very thin paint will just zip around that surface. It'll just go along a panel line or around a rivet or something like that, and that's a standard pin wash. Now, I'm not doing a standard pin wash here. You may be able to tell just by looking at it that there's no gloss varnish on this. This is still matte varnished from before. Why am I doing that? Why haven't I glossed it? I want this to look dirty and grubby. And I don't want nice clean panel lines and shadows around raised detail. I want it to be soft, and because I've left it matte varnished, and matte varnished is a rough surface, the oil paint, when you touch it to the surface like I am here, it will filter out a little bit. The capillary action will draw the paint into all the little nooks and crannies in the matte varnish surface, and you'll see it'll kind of bloom outwards. You'll get this stain around the raised detail. This is what I want, because I want it to look oily and greasy and dirty. Now I will tidy it up in a minute, but for the moment I just want to get the paint down. Now remember, oil paints cure very slowly, so once this paint, even if it's dried out after 5 or 10 minutes, I can still go back in and clean it up. So I'm just working my way around. I'm just getting the paint into the recesses, along edges and around rivets and things like that, wherever I want it, and then I'm just letting it do its magic. I'm letting it just kind of filter out along the matte varnish surface. Once I'd gone around the whole vehicle with this pin wash and given it about 5 or 10 minutes just to flash off and cure a little bit, it was time to go and do the cleanup. Now you might be wondering why I'm doing this and not just using, say, Null Oil. Null Oil is an acrylic paint, and if you paint Null Oil on the surface wherever it goes, you can't remove it. The reason I'm using an oil paint here is because of this step. If you remember, where the paint sort of went on a little wiggly adventure and spread out into all the little nooks and crannies in the varnish, it made those little tide marks. Now oil paints do fade as they dry, so they don't look quite as bold as they did when I first put them on, and you can see they've kind of blended themselves automatically, but I want them to look fainter. So I've got myself a cotton bud, or a Q-tip if you're one of our colonial cousins, and I've got the tiniest, microscopicest amount of oil paint thinner moistened into the cotton bud. It's not dripping wet, it's not, you know, full of thinner. You can see me wiping it off on the back of my hand. I'm also touching onto a piece of kitchen paper that's just off to the side. I want the cotton bud to be ever so slightly damp, not wet, because all I want to do is reactivate the paint a little bit and just fade it into, you know, into the paint behind it. So where I've got a nice obvious tide mark, I'm just very gently fading the edge of that and blending it into the background colours, so it's more of a transition from the pink to the dirty colour. It's not just pink and then dirty colour. And this is why I'm not using Agrax Earthshade or Nuln Oil or any other acrylic based wash type product, not just using, say, an acrylic paint thinned down. Once an acrylic paint's on, it's on. There's no way to do this blending or fading effectively without just repainting. Oil paints give me that freedom. I could quite happily rework these paints for 24 hours. They could sit on there all night. I could come back the next day and still tidy up. Eventually they will permanently set and you'll have a real billy of a time getting them off. But for the sake of this, for the next hour while I'm teasing these and adjusting them, they are perfect. So make sure, if you want to do any kind of intense weathering and staining and streaking, get some oil paints in your collection. Once I'd gone round and cleaned all that up, the next step was to take the same Starship Filth wash and apply it heartily, my friend, to all the tracks. And I'm just slapping it. What am I doing, Ted?
Slap it on.
Exactly, I'm slapping it on. Yes, this is not, although it looks like I'm doing this like you would use a normal oil wash to darken all the recesses, I'm not using it as a pin wash. I'm not using it to get definition to the tracks here. When these are finished, I want them to look not like sort of bright orangey red, just things made of 100% rust. I want them to look a little bit corroded, but not like as rusty as these make them look. That was just a base coat, a guide coat for me. This is just really to darken this brown down for what's to come next in the next few steps. This is just to darken it down, tone it down, bring it back a bit so it's not just this horrible rusty colour that looks cartoony. Now it is collecting in the recesses like a wash would, but that's just, you know, by the by, that's not my intention here. It's purely, I'm applying it more like a filter, just to darken down this rusty red-brown colour. Once that wash had dried, I'm staying with the tracks and I've got myself some Ammo by Mig Track Rust Pigment. If you've not used pigments before, they're brilliant. Pigments are basically paints with no liquid, they're just powdered pigment, hence the name pigment. And this is sticking with the tracks, and again my aim is to make them look like rusty brown metal. You can see here the wash has darkened them, but I still want, it's still a bit too red, and I want a more, it's hard to explain it. I know it in my mind. I want a more muted rust colour. Now I could just use a paint, but I want to take advantage of the fact that the pigments will flow into recesses and in some places remain a little bit textury. It's hard to explain, but pigments have a certain way when you thin them down and use them as a wash or in any other way. They give this natural rusty patchiness, and I don't want it just be an even flat brown colour. I want this pigment to make it look mottled and varied tones here and there. You'll see on the next step how it makes sense, but for the moment I'm just getting this pigment very carefully all over these tracks, because I don't want to get it everywhere, just on the tracks. Once I'd gone round the tracks with the pigment, it was time to get some oil paint thinners and just touch it to the tracks in various places, and this is using the pigments to their strength. I'm not just slopping this everywhere. If I'd applied this as a normal wash, a thin down paint, it would have gone into the recesses. If I'd applied it as just a paint coat, it would have coloured the tracks. But because I've got this powder higgledy-piggledy on the surface and I'm just touching the thinners, then it will dissolve some areas more than others. The pigment will dissolve and then become a paint and then dry out again. In some areas more than others, and this is the varied texture and effect that I want. Where there's been less thinners, there'll be a bit more texture, like real corroded metal. It'll be varied textures. Now you will know I've got some tissue down here on top of my scruffy painting mat. Underneath my scruffy painting mat I have a very nice neat Sunday best painting mat. If you're using pigments, for the love of dog, put down newspaper, cutting mats that are scruffy, anything you can. Although these pigments aren't permanently affixed, they're loosely affixed to the surface with this thinners. We'll fix them in properly later. They're loosely on there, and while they're in solution I can wipe them off like I'm here with a cotton bud. If you get this stuff on your nice clean cutting mat or your trousers or your t-shirt, it's never going to come out. Once it's dried, you're screwed. The only way to get it out is with thinners that will take the marks off your cutting mat. So yeah, put down paper, because this stuff will go everywhere. Next, it's time to go in with the Citadel Nuln oil, and this is just going to go on all the silver parts, say the grills, the handles, the cannons, things like that, gun barrels. This is just basically an off black wash. It's not quite black, it's like a dark blue grey black, and this is just to go into all the recesses of the silver parts and give them some real depth, make them pop. If you paint something just a metallic colour and leave it, it's kind of flat, there's no life to it. If you get a dark wash of some sort, and that can be an oil paint wash, it can be one of these Citadel shades, it can be any kind of just normal paint you've thinned, it gets into all the recesses and it really makes it pop and look a bit more three-dimensional. Those little silver strips around the exhausts, when I paint some around those, I'll get it on that strip you can see here, and also over the edges, just so it collects, and it just gives a little bit of shadowing between the silver and the rusty exhaust. So it's a great way of making depth, and it's a great way of creating a three-dimensionality. Next, I've gone back to the Ulthuan Grey, and this is to do what we talked about earlier when I was doing the pin wash with the Starship Filth, and I said how you want to use oil paints because you can feather them and fade them and clean them up as you go along, and the acrylics are just on, and once they're on, they're on. We're using this now to dry brush and clean up the Nuln oil around things like that handle on the hatch. Where it's gone onto the flat grey area, you've got a little bit of a tide mark, and there's no way to clean that up with a cotton bud, because once it's dry, after a few minutes, it's dry. So this is the only way to fix it, is to go back in with the Ulthuan Grey and just do a little delicate dry brush. It also helps do a little bit of highlighting on that part as well. So I'll do it round the hatch, and I'll do it round the interior of the cupola, just to get rid of any excessive blebs and blobs of Nuln oil that have gone in there, and little watermarks that I may have splobbed on. Now this is where things go a bit wrong, and I have to give you all my apologies. You can see here I've got the Bugman's Glow out, and that can mean only one thing: I'm painting a dude. And Bugman's Glow is the base colour for standard typical flesh. Bugman's Glow, Cadian flesh tone, then Kislev flesh. My plan was to film painting the dude, however a combination of some of the footage didn't come out, thanks camera, and also it was really impractical to film the guy because he's in this turret, and it made filming him and getting a good view of it a right pain in the ass. Normally if you've got a Mini, he's just mounted on a base, and then you've got him in like a little hand grip and he's easy to film, but with this, you see me knocking the camera. I'm trying to get a decent angle while trying to get close enough to see it and paint it and get a good shot for you. Yeah, it didn't work, so unfortunately this is the only footage I've got of painting the dude. But don't worry, although I'm not really going to show you painting the figure in this build, there'll be plenty of other times when I will show you painting dudes. I just kind of should have planned ahead really and not had him pre-mounted into the turret, but hey, what can you do? And there you go, that's my comprehensive guide to painting a figure. Yeah, I know, my apologies, like I say, special ed here. I'll know next time not to have the guy mounted into the turret when I'm going to film painting him. Hello, my name's Foxx, my first tank build, please like and subscribe. subscribe. Anyway, next up, yep, it's decal time. As you can see by this microscopic decal the size of a rice. Now, if you've seen my other videos, you might recognise that it is indeed a Shanghai Dragons logo. Why am I sticking a Shanghai Dragons logo on this model, which is a Hello Kitty tank? There's a very good reason, and if you remember in the first episode, I told you there's a very good reason I'm making this model, and I'll reveal why at the end, so stick around to the end. For this bit though, it's just one decal. Like in the last episode, I'll just shut up and I'll leave you to watch, just more to show you how quick this process is. It's not a long process. And if you're wondering what that multicoloured card in the top left is, that's my white balance test card. Yeah, I forgot to take it out. I'm special, like and subscribe. And that's it, that's the decal. Like we said before, it's a quick process. That was a real-time bit of footage of me doing the decal. Once that had dried off, after about 10 minutes, I went in with some micro set and then a couple of coats of micro sol. This is of course on his back, which is a lumpy bumpy surface, so it was about 3 coats of micro sol after 1 coat of micro set, just to get it to bed down nicely into all the little recesses and crinkles. Decal's done. Once that had all been done, I got out the Vallejo Premium Matte Varnish and just got a quick coat of varnish on the model for 2 reasons. One, to seal in that decal and also to matte it down because it was a bit shiny looking, and also to lock in the pigments on the tracks. Whether you use a pigment fixer or just normal paint thinners or something like that, the pigments you put on a model are never permanently fixed. Even with pigment fixers, once the pigment's on there, if you handle that model, you can very easily take the pigments off. And remember what I said, once they get into your trousers, they're permanent. Once they get on your mum's kitchen table, they're permanent. Once they're on the model, you can easily remove them. Don't ask me, I'm not a physicist. I don't know. But yeah, so you need to lock them in, and there'll be a little bit stuck on there from the thinners I use, but this matte varnish will now just lock them in completely. Now, one other thing to keep in mind when you're varnishing over pigments is that when you do apply that varnish, some of that varnish is still in a liquid state. It's not all aerosolized, and it will dissolve some of the pigments or the powders, whether they're powders like these or Tamiya's pigments. They're squishy makeup pigment type things, the pastels, that's what they call them. I couldn't think of the word. It will dissolve some of them a little tiny bit, and you will sometimes find that when you varnish over your powders or your pigments or your pastels, it will fade them and soften them a little bit. So just take that into account when you're applying the pigments or powders in the first place. I sometimes apply a little bit more than I need because I know some of it will fade back and fade away. It takes a little bit of practice to get used to how much to do, and you kind of get a feel for it, but just keep that in mind when you're applying your pigments. Some of it will fade. Once the varnish is dry, I'm bringing out the Tamiya XF57 buff. Now this is a brilliant trick for weathering your models subtly, and this is a very old technique as well. If you want to give them a slight dusty look, use Tamiya buff. There's two steps to it. First of all, what I'm doing here is I'm doing a very light mist coat over pretty much the whole model. I've got the paint thinned more than normal. With Tamiya it's kind of a 50-50 thinner mix, but this is thinned even more than normal. It's almost like a wash, and I'm just very gently, carefully spraying it over everything. This will give, it won't change the colour, it's a very subtle filter. It'll just shift the model a little bit, it'll warm it, and it'll help everything just blend together a tiny amount, and it will just give it that hint of dustiness. But this is just the first step. Once it's had about 10 or 15 minutes to dry, I'm going back in with the buff again, but what I'm doing now is I'm actually focusing it on areas that I'm going to have dusty and dirty. So on this tank, for example, around the tracks and the bottom of the track areas and the underside, I'm basically going to coat it, and I'm fading it. So when you see me do the underneath in a moment, I'll be basically covering the whole underneath, just as a solid colour almost. When I do the sides, I'll start off solid at the bottom, but I'll fade it slowly. And the trick here is to work at a very low pressure. Like I said, the paint is thinner than normal. I've got the pressure down to about 12 psi because I want to be careful, and I'm using very little paint. I've got the trigger pulled back to full air and a little tiny amount of paint, and it's just slowly building this up from a mist coat to, in some areas, a thicker, almost solid colour. Now you could just do this if you're doing a desert vehicle or a vehicle with very light dusty weathering. This could be your entire weathering coat. This could be all the dirt and dust you need. But it's a real nice way of just getting some use to your vehicle. If you're building a Gumpler, you might concentrate this around the feet and the shins, for example, but give a very light mist coat over the whole model and focus the rest of it on the shins. So this is really the first layer of dust, and this is a light, dry dust effect. Next up, we've got Vallejo flat earth, and the trick we're trying to look for here, the thing we're going to try and simulate, is a gradation between current fresh muddy earth and old dried faded dust. And it's going to go up the vehicle, so the freshest earth at the bottom, the darker brown colours, and the dusty colours at the top, because that's the old stuff. And what we're doing is we're using this as a mid-tone. So the buff was the high tone, the light tone. That goes about halfway up the side of the vehicle, and a quick key coat around the rest of it. This colour, being the mid-tone, will be slapped all over the bottom, same as before, but it will only go about half as high again as the buff. So it'll only go about halfway up the buff coat, if that makes sense. Whereas the buff went halfway up the side, this will go a quarter up the side, and it will fade out into the buff. This represents slightly fresher dirt than the buff colour, but still not quite mud, just more fresher, more recent dirt that's had a time to dry out, but not quite as much as the dirt above. Now we want to go for the real mud colour, and this is German Cavalry Black Brown. I assume the C stands for cavalry. This is your real mud colour, whereas the last one was kind of a chocolatey colour. This is proper dark wet earth. Now we're not looking to recreate mud itself, we're just looking to create the kind of colour of mud or dark earth, and it's exactly the same process as before. We've got a low pressure, and we're going to do, again, cover the bottom completely underneath, and on the sides go up halfway up the previous coat. So remember, the buff went halfway up the side, The middle colour went halfway up the buff, and this one is kind of going halfway up the medium colour, halfway up the last colour. So we're really just getting a hint of it round the bottom of the vehicle here. Underneath will be completely covered in it, and just on the sides here, just a hint of it. And again, it's more careful blending. You've got to take your time. You see me wiggling the brush around like this, it's because I've got almost no paint coming out, and I want to make sure it's blended and faded softly. Now the other advantage is, although I said it's thinner than normal, this is a model colour paint, which by its nature is thick as anything, and you can see me feathering the trigger here. Even though I had it thinned and I had the pressure quite low, it was spluttering a little bit, but this was perfect. I wanted this because I wanted the kind of speckly splutters every now and then to suggest mud splashes. So if you're doing a muddy colour, it is quite good to actually have it a little bit thicker than you'd normally have it, so your airbrush struggles, because you can take advantage of that. And when I'm flicking the trigger like that, I'm just trying to get it to splutter out paint. If you go on the trigger like that, it kind of splutters and splats. It's quite a good little technique to use. An important thing to note that I forgot to mention was, although I'm fading out the colours from dark to light up the side, I am actually going over the tracks with all three colours, because obviously the tracks are the one thing that's constantly in contact with the ground. So although the colour, the mud and dirt may fade up as you go up the side of the vehicle, because of course you're only going to get splashes and splatters so high, the colours need to be on the tracks all the way. Now I'm not trying to completely paint them this dark brown, I'm still trying to keep it a little bit patchy and varied. More of the dark brown at the bottom than the stuff on the top, because that's been exposed to air for a moment, but I am doing the tracks, and this is helping me get that dark track colour. Now it's messy fun times. We have here Ammo by Mig Dark Earth, my absolute favourite pigment in the world. It looks and smells exactly like soil, even though it's a paint pigment. And I've also got myself my oil thinners again. Now we're going to be doing something a little bit different than last time. We're going to put the oil thinners on first and then the pigment, because we're going to use this to simulate proper dirt and mud, and we're going to be super generous. We're basically going to slap all this thinner on the underside here. We want this stuff to stick, and we want it to look lumpy bumpy, because it's supposed to be soil and clods of earth and things like that. We're not just looking for a colour here, we want texture. So if you put the powder on first and then the thinners, it softens it all out. But if you put the thinners on first, that acts as an adhesive layer. Not very adhesive, but it acts as an adhesive layer, because what you do next is that you just, Ted?
Slap it on.
Exactly. You just slap it on. Now the idea here is you're not thinking, you're not planning, you're just getting it all over. Some of it will blend away and flatten out and dissolve into the thinners, but some of it, where you pile it on, won't be dissolved. It will absorb the thinners through capillary reaction and therefore stick on a little bit. It won't just fall straight off, but it will stay textured and lumpy. And the plan here is that I'll do the complete underside totally like this. I really cake it on, and I will go round the tracks and also a little bit up the side, but not very far, because this is your proper, this is the mud that's just been kicked up by the tank driving along, and all the stuff underneath it doesn't dry out because it's underneath where all the water and dirt and muck are. So I'll do the same on the tracks as well, and a little bit up the side. This is super fun. It's real messy times. You have to put paper down. You have to wear the gloves. Trust me, otherwise it's just sadness. And this is what I got at the end of it. Now, I screwed up, and I'm here to report a happy accident. I got all the powders on, I left it to dry for about half an hour, 45 minutes, and then I took it outside and I got a rattle can Warhammer 40K varnish, because it was nice and sunny, and I gave it a quick blap just to lock in all those pigments, because remember, the pigment fixer or the thinners won't hold those pigments in place. Unfortunately, all those thinners hadn't fully flashed off and cured. And it looks like the varnish reacted with some of those thinners, and you can see on here there's some like light patchy areas, little bits where the earth is lighter than normal. That's kind of where it reacted, but it actually came out looking fantastic. It looks like variated sort of damp and slightly less damp earth, so I was actually quite happy with the way it came out. It looks like real soil. The other thing is, because the thinners hadn't fully evaporated, I don't know why, but it made the earth dry darker than normal. That light colour, the little light patches, is what it normally ends up looking like, but because of the reaction between the thinners and the varnish, it's kept some of it looking like dark wet mud. So a bit of a goof on me. I didn't leave it long enough for the thinners to flash off, so if you are doing this, leave it at least a couple of hours, if not more. Maybe leave it overnight just for everything to fully flash off. It's only because we were slopping the thinners around bigly, but it all turned out all right in the end, so happy times. Just the last few bits and bobs to do now. Next up is the searchlight, and I'm going to try something new here. I normally paint searchlights like they're powered on, so they're like white with a yellow glaze around the interior just to make them look like they're on. I'm going to paint this one like it's turned off. I'm going to give it a try. It doesn't come out brilliant, but it kind of works. But you'll see it doesn't make much sense right now. I'm painting the fang and next, I've got the Fenrisian Grey, and for this step we're going to do a glaze. Now a glaze is just like normal painting, but you've got the paint a lot thinner than you normally would, and that makes it more transparent. And the more layers of that paint you add, the less transparent it gets. Now you can use this to do transitions from one colour to another. You start off with one coat of your very thin glaze that you can see through to the colour below. It's almost not there. Then you apply a second coat, but you do it in a smaller area towards where you want the highlight. That's now 2 layers of paint, and it's less transparent. You do then a third coat in a smaller area again towards the middle of the area you want to be the highlight, and each layer you add, that area gets less and less transparent and brighter. This way you can build up a fade from one colour to the other. Every time the area you paint gets smaller, and you're adding more and more layers of the glaze to make it less and less transparent. The other trick, as you can see me doing here, is to paint towards where you want the most pigment. When you paint, you apply the brush to the surface, you move it along, and where you lift off the brush, that's where most of the pigment goes. So always go towards the highlight, not away from the highlight, because that's where you want the pigment to be deposited. Especially when you're glazing, that's where you want the colour to be the boldest. The next step is to go in with some white scar, and this is for the real highlight areas at the top of the lens. You're going to do some fading at the very top of the lens to fade a white area into the blue and the grey, but then we're also going to use it for the spot highlights as well. So starting off, you're doing a glaze like we did before to get the real highlight areas. And then when we get to the end, you'll just do spots, big blobs of white, bright solid white, to suggest that bit where the light is shining. The idea is that the light is shining on the glass at the top and you can see the big white reflections, and the bit at the bottom where it's the light blue colour, that's the ambient light bouncing off the inside and coming back out and refracting through the lens. So you get the highlight at the top and the sort of the sub highlight at the bottom. This is my theory anyway. It's not exactly realistic, but you kind of get the idea. Now you may notice I've not been particularly careful about keeping paint out of those recessed panel lines, and that's 100% because of the next step. I've got myself my trusty bottle of Dr. Martin's Black Star Artist ink, proper artist ink, and all we're going to do is going to do a pin wash into those recessed Fresnel lines. I guess they're like Fresnel lines or something similar. Is it a Fresnel? I don't know. A Fresnel? I don't know about lenses. Anyway, the idea here is we're going to get them into these recesses. Now, you could do this with your Nuln Oil or thinned black paint, but the reason I'm doing this with ink is opaque as basically, much more than paint. So it's just a quick blop in there and it's done. The only thing to watch for is that ink can be reactivated by varnish. So do be careful. Make sure you give it 24 hours once you've done this before you put any gloss varnish on. So I'm getting the ink into those little lines, little recesses. There'll be a little bit of tidy up to do because some of it does splodge outside, but I'm going to go back and tidy up some of the rough areas. And once it's been done, I'll give it a nice couple of gloss coats. I'm going to be using the Citadel Ard Coat gloss varnish because it's a lot more shiny than my normal Pledge, and it's what I've got. So I'll go over and give it a nice glossy gloss coat at the end, just to make it all shiny. Getting towards the end now, we've got the Citadel's Necron compound. It's a dry paint. Dry just means it's almost powder but not quite. It's a little bit liquidy but almost not much. It's like sticky powder. It's kind of weird. You can't expect. It's like a very thick dry brushing paint, and that's what we're going to do. We're going to dry brush this over all the silver parts. So the barrels on the autocannon, we've got the handles, we've got little grills here and there. Anything that was silver, we're going to dry brush this over as minimally as possible, just to brighten it back a little bit. We're not looking at making super shiny metals. We still want them to look battered and worn and used, but it's just going to bring it back a little bit so it's not quite so dark. And now the very last step is to go over with some of the lovely Vallejo acrylic metal colour paint. This is gunmetal grey. These paints are beautiful. The pigment is so fine, it's like painting with liquid metal. It really is. There's no bittiness to these. They're just brilliant. Now I'm going for this gunmetal because it's a dark colour, and I'm going to be using this as a dry brush for primarily the tracks. If you want your tracks to look realistic, and I'm no expert at this, you don't want to get them covered in mud and dirt, because don't forget, the tracks are being scraped across the ground all the time, and all that dirt and dust will wear off and rub off as they move around. So although you want them to be dusty and dirty where the dirt is collected in the recesses, you still want them to have some bare metal areas because they're constantly being rubbed against the ground, and that's where it goes clean. Now I didn't want to use the Necron compound because that's too bright and sparkly. I wanted this stuff because it's darker, it's more subtle, and it's super smooth. There's no grittiness to it, there's no flake or texture. So I'm just lightly going over the tracks, just dry brushing, not massively, just to pick up the edges. This is an edge dry brush just to get that glint, and I'm doing it now because there's no more varnish going over this kit. If I did this before the matte varnish, it would just be lost. I needed to do this step after the matte varnish so that when you move this kit around or you handle it, it will catch the light and glint like the bare metal exposed on real tank tracks. And with that last step done, we are build complete. Yes, everything is now finished, and I've got to say, I'm loving how this has come out. I'm really happy with how the tracks came out. I'm not an armor builder. I'm not used to doing tracks. It's not that long ago I would have just painted them silver and given them black wash. But I'm learning, and I'm trying to learn new methods, and I'm really pleased with how these came out. They have a sort of weight to them, and they look like old tracks. Bearing in mind, of course, in the fiction of the universe, these tanks can be hundreds of years old. They can be in service for hundreds, if not thousands of years. So, yeah, it looks nice and battered. I'm really happy with how it came out. It's a silly, fun build, and I've had a great time. Now, I did say right from the start, from the first episode, that this build was being done for a very specific reason, and that reason is, this is a gift for someone. I'm not doing this for myself. I'm not going to sell it. It's not going to go into my army. One of my very dear friends has been through a tough time over the last few weeks and has sadly had to sell a lot of their stash, a lot of their collection. So I've done this partly because I wanted to get my mojo back, and a silly little fun paint job is always a winner, but also because I wanted to make this for that person, to cheer them up and fill a bit of an empty space on that shelf. So that person who will be getting this tank is my very dear friend who annoyingly can't wear baseball caps correctly, and my patron George. George, this is for you, buddy. I will include it when I send you the Sazabi and the Ridge Runner. I'll include it in there. This can go on your shelf. You can play with it, you can paint it, you can do what you like with it. But this is a gift for you, hopefully just to cheer you up a little bit, put a bit of a smile on your face. So George, you're more than welcome. Enjoy it. I don't know when I'll be able to send it to you because the world's on fire and it might be like another year before I can post stuff. Who knows when everything will go back to normal. But this will be coming your way at some point. It just remains for me, for the rest of you, to say thank you very much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed it and learned something. Take care of yourselves. Don't forget to check out all the links below the video for my usual ways to support this channel. And until next time, take care, wash your damn hands, and I'll say adios amoebas.